Okay, I'm back, and now we're going to go over the lab on rocks and minerals. So open up that lab and follow along as I go through this. So the measuring devices that you need to know how to use would be the hand lens or the magnifying glass, and then also how to use acid to test for the presence of calcium carbonate, calcite. The concepts would be, can you explain what a mineral is? Okay. Could you explain how do you make an igneous rock? Okay, what is weathering? How do you make a sedimentary rock? How do you make a metamorphic rock? We looked at the rock cycle, so you should be able to tell me if you have a igneous rock, what would you do to it in order to change it into a sedimentary rock? Or if I gave you a sedimentary rock, what would you do to it if you wanted to change it into an igneous rock? Okay, so you can essentially take any kind of a rock and turn it into any other kind of rock given the right conditions. So know that rock cycle. Okay, then I wanted you to be able to identify different samples of rocks and minerals. In particular, you should know the minerals quartz and calcite. You should know that they're minerals, and you should know the names of them. So if I put a sample of quartz on the table and ask you what is it, then you could name it as quartz. Okay, then for the igneous rocks, you needed to know granite and basalt. So you should know that they're igneous rocks, and you should know the names of them. And then for the sedimentary, I think that your section chose sandstone, limestone, chert, and then peat. So you should know that those are sedimentary rocks, and you should be able to identify them. There's no math for this particular lab, so that's good. Okay, so let's go on to the lab on weather. So the measuring devices that you made and should know how they work is your homemade barometer. So exactly how did your barometer forecast pressure? How did it work? And then the same thing for your cloud maker. So how did your cloud maker work? All right, now the concepts would be know how the homemade barometer works, know how the cloud maker works, and then also if I told you what the weather conditions were, so I would have to tell you the barometric pressure, I'd have to tell you whether it's going up or down, I would have to tell you the direction that the wind is coming from. So if I gave you this information and I gave you the weather forecast chart, you should be able to look up those conditions on that chart and then tell me what the weather is going to be like in 24 hours. Okay, so that could be on the exam. And then there wasn't any math on that particular lab. Okay, so let's go on to our next lab was on spectroscopy. And so in this lab, what you did was you had a glowing gas tube, and then you had your diffraction grating, which was that piece of plastic that you held up to your eye, and then you looked at that glowing gas tube, and then you are able to see its spectrum. So you saw a bunch of different lines, and then from those lines you could determine what element it was. So what would I like for you to know about that lab? Well, I'd like for you to know how do atoms produce light. So what is it about the electrons that causes light to occur? So this was on your lecture exam as well. Okay, then I'd also like for you to be able to identify an element by looking at its spectrum through the diffraction grating. So you'll get a diffraction grating on the exam. I'll give you a glowing gas tube. You're going to look at it, so you're going to be able to see its spectrum, and then I'll have two computer screens. And one computer screen will have the actual spectrum, and then the other computer screen is not going to have the real spectrum. And then based on what you see through your diffraction grating, you should be able to pick out, is it computer screen A or is it computer screen B? And I will try to pick a spectrum that's fairly easy to identify. So it will be one of the spectrums that you looked at in lab. There's no mathematics for this particular lab. Okay, so let's stop right here, and then when we come back, we're going to look at black bodies.